adventures of Ellen White and the Pioneers. Battling the enemy.
Many times as she wrote out the instruction that the Lord had given to the early Advent believers, Satan tried to stop Mrs. White's work because he did not want the people to hear God's messages. Sometimes he did this by causing sickness in Mrs. White's immediate family, either that of her husband or her children. One of her first experiences when this occurred was in the year 1850, only 6 years after Mrs. White's work began as the messenger of the Lord. At this time, Elder and Mrs. White were living temporarily with the Harris family in Centerport, New York, and their son Edson was with them. One day, they took Elder Rhodes to catch the canal boat, and since it was only 2 miles to the landing, Mrs. White went with them, leaving her year-old son, Edson, with Clarissa, his nurse. When they returned, Mrs. Harris met them at the door. "Your baby is dying," she cried. Rushing to his bed, they found him unconscious, his little eyes closed and his arms purple. Trying to steady her voice, Mrs. White said, "Our only hope is in God. Let us call the elders and pray immediately." "What can we do?" sighed Elder White. "Elder Rhodes is the only minister nearby, and he is on his way to Michigan." Without waiting for an answer, he hurried downstairs, jumped into the carriage, and drove as fast as his old horse Charlie could gallop, back to town and along the path after the canal boat. 5 miles down the path he overtook the boat. Elder Rhodes got off, and they rushed back to the Harrises' home. There in the little upstairs room, they prayed, and they anointed the baby. And immediately he opened his eyes, and he smiled. God had answered their prayer. Not long after this, Satan tried again. This time Elder White became very sick. He had cramps in his stomach, and he suffered excruciating pain. His feet and legs were cold. Many people were dying of cholera in the city at that time, and Mrs. White was afraid that this is what her husband had. "Pray, Ellen, pray," Elder White whispered between his groans. Mrs. Harris, Clarissa, the nurse, and another lady were standing near, and the 3 women knelt beside the bed while Mrs. White laid her hands on her husband's head and pleaded with God for healing. And at once the pain left and the natural colour returned to his face. That same night Satan tried again. At about midnight little Edson was screaming, and they rushed into his room and found Clarissa, his nurse, holding him in her arms. The baby was clinging frantically to her, and now and then he would let go of her, and he would fight in the air with both hands, crying out in terror, "No, no, no." "He sees something that's frightening him, something that's invisible to us," his father said. "Yes," replied Ellen. "I am sure that Satan has sent one of his angels to torment this child." And again they knelt in prayer, and in the name of Jesus, Elder White rebuked the evil spirit, and little Edson immediately fell asleep and did not waken until morning. The next day Elder White had to go to Auburn to receive the first copies of the paper that they were printing. He was still very weak, but he was determined not to let anything stop him from getting out that paper. Mrs. White went with him and drove the carriage the 6 miles to Auburn, and as they travelled, Elder White slowly gained strength. All of Satan's schemes had not delayed the paper even one day. They brought the printed sheets home, and they called the members of the family together to fold and address them. It was hard work, and they scarcely had time to eat. But finally the task was finished, and the Whites were off again. And since they had loaned their horse, old Charlie, and the carriage to one of the travelling ministers, they needed to make the short trip to where they were going in a farm wagon. James and Ellen White sat on the high seat in the front. Suddenly the horses sheeled, and the wagon was thrown against a steep embankment and turned over on its side. Crawling out from beneath the wagon, they scrambled to their feet. "Are you hurt, Ellen?" "No, I'm not. How about you?" "I'm not hurt either." And so they straightened up the wagon, and they went on their way with a song of thanksgiving. It was not long after this that their nurse Clarissa became severely ill, and she too was healed by prayer, and again Satan's plans to stop their work was defeated. It was about this time that Mrs. White wrote to her friend Mrs. Bates, saying, "Oh, what battles we've had to fight with the enemy since we commenced to get out this paper. We have had to pray, 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 and have faith, faith, and faith. This is the only way we would have been able to live," Mrs. White said. She was shown that Satan wanted to stop the paper because it would go to places where God's servants could not go. They were tempted to become discouraged, but the more trouble that the devil caused them, the more earnestly they prayed, and the more diligently they worked. Satan worked in other ways to try to stop Mrs. White's work. On one occasion, some time later, Mrs. White said to her boys, "Today we must get ready for our Sabbath appointment at Windsor. We'll need to clean the carriage, because after the many miles it's taken us over the muddy roads, it surely does show a sad appearance." So the carriage was brought out, and Edson gave it a thorough washing. Their other son, Willie, took down the ragged side curtains and helped his mother clean and mend them. They patched and washed the oilcloth seat covers, and they laid them out to dry. They were to start out early morning, for Windsor was a full day's drive away. But in the morning, when Willie went to open the stable door to get out the two horses, Jack and Jim, he cried out, "Mother, oh mother, come and see what's happened." 2 big water pails that they had used and the tub that they'd used in washing the carriage was smashed and stamped to pieces. The carefully mended curtains and the seat covers were torn to strips. Mrs. White sighed as she looked at the ruin around her. But when she saw their horse, poor old Jack, trembling with pain from a gash in his side, she could have cried. The culprit that caused this damage was a neighbour's workhorse, which shared the stable with the 2 carriage horses, and he'd been left loose and spent much of the night causing the destruction. Jim, the other horse, was unhurt. He had slipped his halter and he escaped, and Willie found him crowded between the carriage and the stable wall. Jack tried to tell about his sufferings by neighing pitifully. Ellen took a long look and said to the boys, "You know who is truly responsible for this. It's our great enemy who's always trying to discourage us. But shall we let him? No, never. We will have to postpone our meeting at Windsor this time, but we shall go there eventually. When Satan tries to discourage us, let us remember Mrs. White's experience and ask Jesus to help us. And let us remember to pray. Jesus is always able to prevent Satan from hindering his work." Come and join us next time to hear about how we ought to obey God rather than men.